The night inside the palace was made of whispers. Every sound carried a secret. The slide of silk across polished floors, the sigh of lantern flames in the corridor, the muted clink of jade ornaments as servants passed like shadows. You had long since learned to tell what kind of mood the palace wore by its silence, and tonight it trembled between calm and warning. The air was perfumed with sandalwood and something heavier, a scent that clung to the back of your throat like fear. You stirred before dawn, as you always did. The world outside the curtains still slept, but the palace never truly did. You were a lady in waiting to the Empress, and in this place sleep was an act of trust, one few could afford. You slipped from your mat, wrapping your robe tighter, the floor cool beneath your bare feet. From the far end of the corridor, you could hear the rhythmic scrape of a broom, the distant murmur of eunuchs changing guard. Every sound here had its place, its meaning. Every pause could mean danger. When you pushed aside the curtain to her chamber, the scent of her perfume reached you first, jasmine and something faintly metallic like tears. The Empress was still awake. She sat by the great bronze mirror, her hair unbound, falling in dark rivers over her shoulders. Candlelight trembled against the metal, softening her reflection until it looked less like a woman and more like a memory of one. She had been sitting like that for hours. You knew because you had stood in this doorway before, watching her the way one watches a flame, drawn, cautious, helpless. The crown she wore earlier that day rested on a cushion beside her, its jewels dull in the half-light. It looked oddly small without her beneath it, like a symbol detached from its meaning. "Your Majesty," you said softly, bowing low, "shall I prepare the morning robe?" She didn't turn. "The morning is not yet born," she murmured. "Let it sleep a little longer." Her voice carried the weariness of someone who has spoken too carefully for too long. You remained kneeling, waiting, until she finally glanced at you through the mirror. Her eyes caught the candlelight, a depth of gold and shadow that could unnerve even the bravest of courtiers. You had once thought her gaze sharp, but over the months you had come to see what lay behind it. Exhaustion disguised as grace. "They say the palace is at peace," she said, almost to herself. "But peace here feels like suffocation." You hesitated. The wrong answer could end a life, but the wrong silence could, too. "Your Majesty carries the weight of the realm," you replied gently. "It is natural to feel the air heavy." She smiled faintly, a smile that did not reach her eyes. "You have learned the art of saying everything and nothing. That is how one survives here." Outside, the first hint of dawn began to soften the darkness. Through the lattice, the sky turned the color of pale ink, and the sound of distant bells announced the changing of the night watch. You moved to light the incense at her bedside, the smoke curling upward in thin, uncertain threads. The Empress watched it as though it held the shape of her thoughts. "I dreamed once," she said suddenly, her tone distant. "Before all this, I dreamed of a house by the sea. The waves came and went, but they always returned. Here, nothing returns. Everything is taken." You wondered whether she expected an answer. You had never seen the sea. You could not imagine what freedom sounded like. So you only bowed your head and listened, because sometimes silence was the greatest kindness you could offer. As you arranged your robe, your fingers brushed the fabric, heavy brocade lined with pearls. The garment shimmered in the faint light, exquisite and suffocating. The Empress stood, her movement fluid yet deliberate, as though she had rehearsed even the act of breathing. You draped the robe over her shoulders and caught the faint tremor in her hands. "The Emperor has been distant again," she said. The words were calm, but you could hear the crack beneath them. "They say, he rides at dawn to inspect the troops. Perhaps he rides for me." You dare to glance upward. "You are the heart of the empire, Majesty. Even if he forgets, the heavens remember." She laughed softly, the sound brittle as frost. "The heavens remember nothing. They watch and do not speak." The palace began to stir beyond the chamber walls. Footsteps murmured greetings, the metallic hum of gongs marking the 5th hour. Servants would soon enter to prepare the audience hall. You helped her fasten the last clasp at her throat, your hands steady though your pulse raced. Her reflection in the mirror was flawless now, serene and inscrutable, but you could see it. The small shadow at the corner of her mouth, the quiet ache in her posture. She looked every inch an empress, yet the woman beneath the title was unraveling one thread at a time. You knew the danger of sympathy here. To pity was to align yourself with ruin. And yet, as you stepped back and bowed, you felt it, a tug of something like sorrow, something you could not unlearn. She turned toward the balcony, and for a moment the morning light touched her face. It softened the sharpness, revealing the youth she had been, the girl promised to a throne she did not choose. The city stretched beneath her, rooftops glinting in the new sun, the distant hum of prayers rising from the temples. The empire seemed eternal, but you could feel how fragile it was, how easily beauty could turn to ashes. "You think they love me?" she asked suddenly, without looking back. The question startled you. "They fear you, Majesty." "Fear is not love," she said quietly, "but it lasts longer." You had no answer. A breeze drifted through the open doors, stirring the curtains. The silk brushed your cheek like a sigh, carried with the faint murmur of the city awakening, a reminder that life outside the palace still belonged to the living. Here, everything beautiful was trapped, preserved, drained of its warmth. You wondered then what her life might have been if she had been born anywhere else. Would she have laughed freely? Would she have walked barefoot through rain? Or was she always meant to be this? A statue carved in perfection, worshipped yet untouched? The thought lingered as you bowed once more. "Your Majesty, the court awaits." She nodded, drawing her composure around her like another layer of silk. As she passed, her sleeve brushed your hand. Light, accidental, but enough to make your skin burn with the weight of all that could never be spoken. You watched her go, her footsteps silent, her back impossibly straight. When she was gone, you lingered in the doorway, staring at the space she had left behind. The incense smoke curled upward, twisting into nothing. Beyond the curtains, the morning sun struck the palace roofs until they gleamed like fire. Imagine living in a world where every whisper could cost your life, and your body was never truly your own. Would you still dream? If you love forgotten voices of history, stay close. Let's walk softly through her story. You were born beneath the sound of temple bells. They said the heavens rang them for you, that your cry, thin and new, carried a blessing. Servants whispered it was an omen of fortune. Your mother smiled but did not look at you long. Her duty was to recover. Yours was to become perfect. In your family, love came second to destiny. From your earliest memory, the house smelled of sandalwood ink and rules. Tutors bowed to your father before they taught you. You learned the language of restraint before you could read a poem. How to lower your gaze, how to smile without showing teeth, how to walk as if your ankles were tied with invisible silk. To be graceful was not decoration, it was defense. Every motion was a lesson in control. When you were 5, they placed a brush in your hand and told you that every stroke revealed character. You practiced until your wrists ached, the black ink trembling at the edge of each line. You thought, foolishly, that if you could make your writing beautiful enough, someone might notice you behind it. They noticed the neatness, not the longing. At 7, you learned music. Your teacher was an old eunuch who smelled of camphor and dust. He said the lute could calm tempers and soften hearts, but only if played without pride. "A good melody is humble," he told you, pressing your small fingers against the strings. You nodded obediently, though even then you wondered if music could ever belong to those forced to play it. As you grew, praise became a kind of currency. A gentle nod from your father, a faint smile from your mother. Those were your wages for obedience. You learned to hide any spark of temper, to replace curiosity with caution. When other children laughed too loudly, you envied them. But envy, like laughter, was unbecoming. So you folded it into silence and wore it like another layer of silk. The older you became, the more you were prepared for a world you had not chosen. Tutors drilled you in classics, the virtues of obedience, the wisdom of yielding, the poetry of sacrifice. A wife's strength, they said, lies in her softness. You memorized the lines until they blurred together. Still, sometimes at night, you whispered the words differently, changing endings, giving heroines a courage they were denied. It felt like a sin, but a gentle one. By 12, your reflection had begun to matter. Servants brushed your hair until it shone like lacquer. Gold pins replaced the simple ribbons of childhood. The mirror became both friend and warden. It told you how much you were worth, and how easily that worth could vanish. Your mother began to visit your chamber more often. She would sit beside you in silence, her eyes traveling over your features as if counting coins. Once, she sighed and said, "You are beautiful, my daughter. Remember, beauty is not a gift. It is a promise that others will collect." You didn't understand then, not fully, but you would. The day the imperial emissaries arrived, the air in the courtyard felt too thin. Their robes shimmered like the surface of a blade. They bowed to your father and spoke in the polished phrases of power. You stood behind a screen, unseen but not unnoticed, every movement rehearsed. You were not a girl anymore. You were an offering. That night, you heard the word betrothal whispered in the corridors. The emperor's youngest brother sought a wife of noble birth. He had seen your portrait, painted by an artist who'd never looked you in the eye, and declared your expression auspicious. You were 13. The decision was already made. When your mother told you, her voice was soft, almost tender. "You will be cherished," she said, though her eyes glistened. You asked what he was like, this man who would become your husband. She hesitated too long. "He is powerful," she finally said, as though that were the same thing as kind. The weeks that followed blurred into preparation. Seamstresses filled your chamber, their needles clicking like tiny heartbeats. Gold thread, phoenix motifs, layers of crimson silk. It was as if they were building a cage stitch by stitch. Musicians practiced a wedding procession in the courtyard until the melody haunted your dreams. The astrologers consulted charts, declaring the date auspicious, the stars merciful. You wished they would ask the stars what you wanted. None did. Your father began to treat you like porcelain, admired, rarely touched. Every word he spoke was about alliance and legacy. You were to unite two great houses, strengthen the dynasty, ensure harmony. You nodded, smiling when expected, while inside you felt something close to vanishing. The night before the ceremony, your mother came to your chamber again. She brushed your hair as she had when you were little, each stroke slower than the last. "You will not understand now," she whispered, "but this is how we protect our families. A woman's endurance is her weapon." You wanted to ask, "Protect us from what?" But her eyes were already wet, and her mouth was trembling. You realized she wasn't talking about families at all. She was talking about survival. At dawn, the palace was drenched in gold. Musicians played. Petals fell from the balconies like rain. You were dressed layer upon layer until your breath came shallow. The phoenix crown was placed upon your head, its weight pressing into your temples. When the veil descended, the world turned red. You could barely see the faces around you, only shapes, movement, the shimmer of power. The palanquin swayed as you were carried toward the imperial gates. Through the slits in the curtain, you glimpsed the city. People lined the streets, shouting blessings, eyes bright with curiosity. They didn't know your name, yet they cheered as though you were already theirs. You realized then that you belonged to everyone, except yourself. Inside the palace, the air changed. The sound of the crowd faded into the hush of corridors, endless and echoing. You were led through gates so high they swallowed the sky, past walls carved with dragons, past fountains that never ceased their murmuring. Everything glittered, everything watched. When you reached the ceremonial hall, he was waiting. The prince, your husband, stood beneath a canopy of silk, expression unreadable. You bowed as taught, reciting the words of devotion that had been written for you centuries before you were born. He lifted your veil briefly, just enough for formality, his eyes assessing rather than seeing. "You will serve the empire well," he said. It was not a compliment. It was an instruction. That night, when the attendants left you alone, you sat beside the window, listening to the crickets. The palace roofs glowed faintly under moonlight, each one a reminder of the world that would never again belong to you. You touched the edge of the phoenix crown, feeling the small bruises it had left against your skin. You wonder if every queen in history had worn it like this, with pride on the outside and pain beneath. You were not yet 15, but already you understood what your mother had meant. Power did not arrive with a crown. It began the day you realized you were nothing but a pawn. What would you have done if you were her, born to be watched, never to be free? You were crowned beneath the scent of incense and fear. The drums of the coronation still echoed in your ears when you realized how quiet the palace truly was. Behind the music, behind the silks and proclamations, there lived a silence so deep it pressed against your ribs. The throne room glimmered with jade and bronze, but to you it felt colder than winter stone. You smiled when they bowed, as a queen should, and learned your first truth. Power is not warmth. It is distance. Days became ceremonies, each one heavier than the last. At dawn, you bowed to the ancestors. At noon, you met the ministers. At night, you performed the rituals of grace, smiling until your jaw ached. The emperor, your husband, came and went like a season you could not predict. Sometimes he was gentle, offering polite questions about your health or the color of your robe. Other times he was absent for weeks, leaving only the faint trace of his perfume in the corridor outside your chamber. They told you not to ask where he went. The emperor's time belonged to the realm, not to his wife. You pretended not to hear the laughter from the concubines' quarters at night, the faint notes of music drifting down corridors where you were forbidden to walk. You imagined them, women wrapped in crimson, pouring wine with trembling hands, their voices soft with practiced sweetness. And though jealousy was unbecoming of an empress, it came to you anyway, creeping through your sleep like a shadow you could not drive away. The palace itself became your rival, vast, watching, alive. Courtyards bloomed with orchids and betrayal. Every servant had two faces, every smile a double meaning. The eunuchs bowed too deeply, the ministers praised too loudly, and the concubines whispered behind their painted fans, like birds pretending not to bite. You learned to speak with your eyes and listen without moving. You learned the art of breathing without sighing, of hurting without flinching. At first, you thought obedience would keep you safe. You performed your duties perfectly, hosting banquets, distributing silks, lighting incense to the ancestors with hands that never trembled. You did everything right, and still, you were alone. Loneliness became your only companion. And even it grew heavy, pressing on your chest until you could hardly breathe. Then, one evening, a court musician played for you, a simple melody, mournful and raw. The sound moved through the air like a confession. You felt something stir inside you, something fragile and forbidden. It wasn't love. Not yet. It was recognition. The sound of another soul trapped in the same cage. You began to summon him often. At first, it was for music, nothing more. You would sit behind a veil while he played, your face hidden in the flicker of lanterns. The notes drifted like petals, soft enough to seem harmless. But they were not harmless. They filled the emptiness that silence had claimed, and that was a beginning of danger. He never looked at you directly. He bowed so low that you could barely see his face. And yet, each time the music ended, your heartbeat lingered on the edge of the last note. You wondered if he could hear it. You told yourself that what you sought was beauty, not affection. But beauty is never innocent in a place where love is currency. The courtiers began to notice. You caught it in their eyes. The flicker of curiosity, the careful glances exchanged like passing coins. One concubine smiled too sweetly and said, "The Empress favors the arts these days." You answered with grace, though your pulse stung in your throat. "Music is divine," you said. "Even silence must bow to it." She laughed behind her fan, and you knew the words would spread. To distract them, you filled your court with poets and painters. You invited them to recite verses, to capture the soul of the empire in ink and song. The halls bloomed with color and noise again, and for a while it seemed to work. The emperor praised your taste, calling you a patron of refinement. The ministers nodded approvingly, but the whispers didn't stop. They only changed shape. They said you loved too deeply the words of men. They said you lingered too long in the garden at dusk, listening to verses that spoke of longing. They said you laughed too softly when the flute trembled at the end of the song. You had become a story, and stories, once born, cannot be controlled. The emperor visited you less often after that. When he did, his tone had changed. He asked about the musicians, about the scholars you invited, about your walks in the moonlight. You answered calmly, your voice even, your face serene. But inside, fear coiled like smoke. You had done nothing wrong, not yet. But in this world, innocence had never been protection. Still, you could not stop seeking what little warmth life allowed you. You found it in the quiet hours between dusk and dawn, when the palace slept and you sat alone by the window, watching the reflection of the moon ripple in the pond below. You imagined stepping through that reflection into another world, one without titles, without eyes watching from behind silk screens. You imagined laughter that did not need permission. Some nights you wrote poetry, though you never signed your name. The verses were simple, unpolished, full of yearning. You hid them between the pages of official ledgers, knowing no one would dare read them. To write was to remember that you still existed beyond the title carved into your life. And yet, even rebellion must wear a veil. You continue to play your role, the dutiful Empress, the gracious hostess, the symbol of divine harmony. You smiled during ceremonies until your cheeks ached. You offered blessings to women who despised you and gifts to men who plotted your downfall. You did it all with such perfection that even the emperor could not tell where devotion ended and defiance began. But in the quiet, when you removed the golden pins from your hair and felt the weight lift, you understood the truth of your life. The crown was not your prison. The silence was. Every thought you could not speak, every touch you could not seek, every breath you had to measure, all of it built the bars around you. You began to dream again, not of escape, but of being seen. Perhaps that was your first act of rebellion. Not a kiss, not a word, but the daring to imagine that someone might one day look at you and see more than an empress. Desire, once locked away, turns to madness when denied the warmth of touch. It began, as most disasters do, with a whisper. No edict, no battle cry. Only the fragile rustle of words traded between frightened mouths. A court musician, they said, had lingered too long in the Empress's chamber. That was all it took. One rumor, light as breath, slipped beneath the lacquered doors and multiplied like smoke. By the time dawn came, it had grown teeth. You sensed it before you heard it. The stillness in the corridors no longer felt like peace. It pulsed with warning. Servants greeted you too carefully. Eunuchs bowed lower than they ever had, eyes fixed on the floor. The palace, once merely cold, had turned watchful. It was as though the walls themselves had learned to listen. The musician, your musician, was gone. His quarters stood empty, his instruments stacked neatly beside the window, as if he had vanished mid-song. When you asked, no one answered. The silence around his name was thicker than denial. It clung to the air, heavy with fear. That was when you knew. Something had been set in motion, and you could no longer stop it. Rumor spreads fastest in places where truth is forbidden. In the women's wing, concubines whisper behind their painted fans, glances sharp as needles. The Empress favors her musicians, they murmured. She keeps them past curfew. Their voices were low, but the palace carried sound the way a temple carries prayer. Upward, outward, unstoppable. You tried to go about your duties. You hosted the rituals, recited the poems of virtue, smiled when the ministers' wives came bearing false sympathy. But the air had changed. Each compliment carried a sting. Each bow had amusement. It was as if the whole court waited for you to stumble. One evening, while preparing for the ancestral rites, your chief attendant knelt and whispered, "A servant from the music quarters has disappeared." Her voice trembled. You dismissed her quickly, not out of cruelty, but mercy. The fewer who spoke of it, the longer she would live. The court punished not only sins, but the proximity to them. Days passed before the emperor returned from his campaign. You met him in the Hall of Harmony, beneath the painted dragons coiling across the ceiling. His eyes, once curious, now measured you the way generals measure enemy terrain. He spoke of the rebellion in the south, the harvest, the stars, everything but the rumors. Still, the silence between his words told you he had heard. You offered him tea. The steam rose between you, veiling your faces. "The court seems restless," you said softly. He did not look at you. The court is easily led astray. Whispers, when unchecked, can rot an empire. You want to tell him you knew that already, that whispers had been rotting you for years. But you only bowed your head. Then we must be vigilant, your majesty. He set down the cup. Indeed. That night, he did not visit your chambers. The next morning, soldiers appeared outside the women's quarters. They said nothing, but their presence was its own decree. Servants began vanishing one by one. A maid who once brushed your hair, a eunuch who tuned the zither. Their absences left the air hollow. The few who remained spoke only in fragments. The musician, someone whispered, confessed, another dared. No one finished the sentence. Sleep deserted you. When the candles burned low, you sat by the window, watching the moon dissolve behind clouds. You thought of the garden, your secret refuge, and of the music that had once filled it. The melodies now haunted you. How easily beauty had turned into danger. How easily affection had become a weapon. By the 7th day, the investigation reached you. The chancellor himself arrived, cloaked in solemnity. He bowed deeply, then presented a scroll sealed in red wax. For the sake of harmony, he intoned, we must confirm the purity of the inner court. The phrase tasted of poison. You knew what it meant. Confession without defense. You signed your name where they told you to, knowing protest would change nothing. The emperor's authority was divine. Yours was borrowed. And borrowed power is always returned with interest. That night, thunder rolled above the palace. Rain lashed against the windows, streaking the glass like tears you could not shed. Alone in your chamber, you removed the gold pins from your hair and let it fall loose. The candlelight trembled. You thought of the musician's last glance, his eyes lowered, his bow deep, the faint tremor in his hands. Did he know it would end like this? Perhaps he did. Men in palaces learn quickly that truth is a blade best left sheathed. In the following days, the inquiry grew like a storm. Ministers debated, courtiers speculated. Poets rewrote verses to flatter the emperor's virtue. The palace thrived on scandal the way gardens thrive on rain. What was rumor became accusation. What was accusation became law. You stopped listening. The words blurred into one dull hum, the sound of your own undoing. When the decree finally came, it was merciful only in its formality. The Empress shall remain in seclusion, it read, until the doubts surrounding her conduct are dispelled. Seclusion, another beautiful word that meant imprisonment. You were escorted to your private wing, stripped of attendance and ceremony. Even your reflection seemed to vanish. The mirrors had been removed. In isolation, you began to hear the palace differently. Without music, every sound grew sharper. The drip of water from the eaves, the flutter of scrolls in distant chambers, the shuffle of guards outside your door. You wonder if the emperor still believed in your guilt, or belief even mattered. In this world, appearances were reality. Truth was an inconvenience too fragile to survive. The walls that once gleamed with gold now closed around you like ribs of a beast. You traced the carvings with your fingers, following the lines of dragons and clouds, wondering which would outlast the other, the empire or its lies. You realizing that your life had become a reflection of the dynasty itself, splendid on the surface, hollow underneath. One evening, you asked the guard for paper and ink. He hesitated before delivering them. You wrote not a plea but a remembrance, a poem no one would read. In it, you described the rain over the garden, the way the lilies had bent beneath its weight, but did not break. You sealed it without signing your name, then burned it. Some beauty, you thought, was not meant to be kept. Weeks passed. The emperor never came. Outside your confinement, the empire's troubles deepened. Floods in provinces, murmurs of revolt, ministers plotting succession. You wondered if they saw the irony. The court that condemned you for desire now crumbled under its own greed. One night, as you lay awake, you heard footsteps halt outside your door. A voice murmured, one you almost recognized. "Forgive me, your majesty," it whispered. He asked for loyalty. Then the footsteps faded, leaving only the echo of betrayal. You understood. The musician was gone for good. In the silence that followed, your fear hardened into something else. Not hatred. That was too simple. It was knowledge. You saw the empire for what it truly was, a fragile theater where men mistook cruelty for order. You had been its centerpiece, its ornament, its justification. Now, stripped of illusion, you became its mirror. You would not break. You would not plead. You would learn instead how to exist inside the crack without shattering. Because in a world ruled by men, even love becomes a weapon, and you were learning to wield it. It began with a door no one else noticed. A narrow wooden frame half hidden behind a tapestry, its hinges mottled with age. You found it by accident one afternoon, wandering the lesser corridors of the palace. Corridors the emperor never walked, corridors that smelled of dust and fading incense. When you pressed the latch, the door yielded with a soft sigh, as though it had been waiting for your touch. Beyond it lay the hidden garden. The first time you stepped inside, the world changed shape. The air was cooler there, the light diffused through bamboo leaves. A shallow pond mirrored the sky, its surface broken only by the lazy drift of white lilies. You stood beneath an arch of flowering plum trees and listened. To silence, real silence, the kind that had no motive. For the first time in years, you could breathe without witnesses. It was not a grand garden. No marble walkways, no gilded fountains, no carved dragons spouting water. Only stone paths softened by moss and the hum of life. Frogs, crickets, the faint rustle of petals against water. But its simplicity made it sacred. It was a corner of the empire untouched by performance. You felt, standing there, like the world had momentarily forgotten you, and in that forgetting, given you back to yourself. You began returning often, always at dusk, when the courtyards glowed with lantern light, and the officials were busy rehearsing their loyalty. The guards assumed you prayed in solitude. The servants knew better than to ask. You walked the narrow passage alone, carrying only a small oil lamp. Each step through that door felt like shedding a layer of skin, the Empress fading, the woman emerging. It wasn't long before others found their way to you, those the palace itself had swallowed and forgotten. A eunuch who had once studied philosophy before his body was claimed for service. A musician with trembling hands, forbidden to perform before the emperor after a single wrong note. A scholar sent to the archives for offending a minister's vanity. They came cautiously at first, unsure of your motives. But when they saw that you sought not flattery, only conversation, they began to speak freely. You called them your companions, though the court would have called them fools. Together, you built a world out of stolen hours. The eunuch tended the lilies. The scholar recited verses banned from the capital. The musician mended the cracked bamboo flute. In their presence, you rediscovered laughter, not the polite kind, but the helpless, unguarded kind that escaped before you could stop it. The sound startled even you. One evening, when the moon hung low and pale, the scholar asked gently, "Do you ever tire being worshipped?" You smiled at the question. "I do not think worship is what they feel." You said, "It is obedience, a colder thing." He nodded. "Then here, may you be disobedient." You laughed again, softer this time, and said, "Perhaps I already am." As the nights grew warmer, the garden began to feel alive in ways the palace never could. The air carried the sweetness of night-blooming jasmine. You would sit beneath the plum trees while the musician played, his melody winding through the dark like smoke. The eunuch brewed tea that tasted faintly of citrus and memory. The scholar brought scrolls of forgotten poetry, words written by women who had dared to speak, their verses surviving only as fragments. You read them aloud, savoring each line like confession. Here, no one bowed. No one knelt. You were not the Empress, but simply a woman listening to the rain on the lotus leaves. Sometimes a musician would pause and look up at the sky, as though waiting for the gods to notice. You envied him that faith. You had once believed the heavens cared for those beneath crowns. Now you knew better. Even the gods preferred distance. But the human heart cannot live on distance. One night, near midsummer, the rain arrived sudden and heavy. You and your companions sheltered under the veranda, watching the droplets shatter the pond into ripples. The musician lifted his flute, playing softly against the rhythm of the storm. The melody was simple, a lullaby from his childhood. Without thinking, you reached out, just a small gesture, your fingers brushing the bamboo as he played. He stilled, but did not pull away. The air seemed to hold its breath. You withdrew your hand and whispered, "Continue." He did, though the notes trembled. When the rain ended, you walked alone among the soaked flowers. The petals clung to your sleeves, pale against the silk. You felt something stir deep within you, a longing not for power or freedom, but for understanding. You wondered if that was what the poets meant by desire, not possession, but recognition. After that night, the garden changed. It remained your refuge, but now each visit carried a pulse beneath the calm. You and the musician spoke little, yet silence itself became charged. A glance lasted too long. A word lingered after it was spoken. The eunuch noticed first. One evening, as he trimmed the vines, he said quietly, "Even in hidden places, Majesty, the wind carries whispers." You looked away, pretending you did not understand. Soon, the whispers began again, faint, formless, but growing. The servants noticed your absences. Ministers asked cautious questions about your fondness for the arts. You smiled and said, "Art is prayer." They nodded, pretending to believe you. But the palace, like a jealous god, tolerated no devotion that was not directed toward itself. Still, you could not stay away. The garden had become the only place where you remembered what it meant to feel alive. You returned at dusk, despite the risks, despite the guards who now lingered longer at the gate. Each time you crossed the threshold, your pulse steadied, as if the flowers themselves promised forgiveness. Then came the night of the full moon, the forbidden hour. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies. The others had already left. You stood by the pond alone, the water silver under the light. Somewhere in the distance, a flute played, faint, sorrowful, beautiful. You closed your eyes. For that single hour, you let yourself forget everything. The crown, the accusations, the fear. There was only sound and night and breath. When you opened your eyes, you saw him. The musician stood at the far edge of the garden, half hidden by the shadows. He bowed, slowly as he had the first night. Neither of you spoke. The silence between you was its own language, one that needed no words. Then, as quietly as he had come, he turned and disappeared into the darkness. You stayed until dawn, watching the lilies close as the sun rose, their petals folded inward, secretive, as though guarding something fragile. You understood them perfectly. Every secret garden is planted with both flowers and thorns. Pause for a moment. Can you feel the weight of secrecy pressing against her chest? The rain began just before dusk, slow, hesitant, like a conversation the sky was afraid to start. It fell softly over the western pavilion, drumming against the roof in a rhythm that was neither mournful nor kind, only inevitable. You sat by the window, watching the drops gather on the paper lanterns until they trembled and broke. The air smelled of wet earth and sandalwood. In that moment you thought, so this is how the world cleanses itself, one quiet drop at a time. Your chamber was small now, stripped of its former grandeur. The gold screens had been replaced with plain wood, the silks with linen. Only a single candle burned beside you, its flame bending with every sigh of wind. You had dismissed the attendants hours ago. You wanted this night to belong to no one but yourself. On the table before you lay 3 sheets of rice paper, unrolled and waiting. You had decided to write letters, not to the emperor, nor to the ministers, nor to history. Those people had already taken too much. These letters were for the world that would come after you, for the girl who might one day stand where you once stood, wearing the same heavy crown and wondering why it felt like a shackle. You dipped the brush into ink, watching the black bleed through the fibers. To the woman I will never meet, you began. You will be told that obedience is safety, that silence is grace, that the world will reward you for enduring. They will be wrong. The world remembers only those who dare to be human, even when humanity is forbidden. The words flowed gently, steady and unhurried. There was no bitterness in them, only truth, the kind you had carried like a hidden ember for years. You paused to rest your wrist, feeling the ache in your bones. Age had not claimed you, but weariness had. The body, like a dynasty, tires from too much restraint. Outside, thunder murmured distantly. The rain grew stronger. You wondered if the lilies in the hidden garden still stood, or if the storm had bowed them. You had not seen that place in months, yet it lived in you still. The the scent of moonlight and wet stone, the laughter that had once filled it. You smiled faintly, not in sorrow, but in remembrance. That garden had been your truest self. Beautiful, temporary, and misunderstood. You returned to the letter. Do not let them convince you that virtue and silence are the same thing. The world will call you dangerous for feeling too deeply, for wanting too much. But want itself is not sin. Only those who have never starved can fear hunger. When the ink dried, you folded the paper carefully and set it aside. Then you took another sheet, blank and wide as night. This one was harder. To him you wrote. You did not use his title. The word emperor no longer belonged between you. You once told me that love weakens rulers. Perhaps you were right. It certainly weakened me. But love also makes witnesses of us. And I saw you, truly saw you, behind all your borrowed divinity. You wanted to be more than a symbol. I wanted the same. We both failed. And perhaps that is the one honest thing we ever shared. Your hand trembled slightly as you wrote the final line. Not from sadness, but from relief. You had spent years trying to make sense of him, of power wrapped in loneliness, of affection twisted into law. Now you understood. He had been a prisoner too, locked in his own myth. You let the brush fall. The candle flickered, casting the shadow of your profile against the wall. It startled you, how familiar it looked, how alive. For a fleeting second, you imagined historians who would come centuries later, writing your story without knowing your voice. They would call you vain, perhaps cruel, perhaps mad. They would not know that madness was sometimes the only refuge sanity allowed. You rose and crossed the room slowly, bare feet against the cool floor. In the mirror, the woman who gazed back at you no longer looked like an empress. Her hair, unbound, fell like ink across her shoulders. Her eyes held neither fear nor pride, only clarity. You touched the glass, fingertips meeting reflection, and whispered, "Remember me as I was, not as they will say I was." The rain softened. The candle was burning low, its wax pooling at the base like melted time. You sat again and took up the final sheet of paper. For a while, you simply listened to the steady breathing of the world, to your own heartbeat slowing into rhythm with the rain. To the heavens, you wrote last, though you were not sure you believed in them anymore. If there is mercy, let it be this, that I am remembered as someone who tried to live truthfully in a place built on pretending. Do not make me a warning. Let me be a question instead. You laid the brush down and leaned back, eyes half closed. The room was warm with candlelight, yet somewhere beneath it lingered the scent of ashes, faint, almost imagined. Perhaps the palace was burning your last portraits even now. You did not care. Fire could take what it pleased. You had already surrendered everything except your stillness. You thought of your mother then, the way she had brushed your hair on the night before your wedding, her eyes full of words she never said. You had hated her obedience once, but now you saw the truth. It had been armor. Every generation of women in your line had learned to wear endurance like silk, soft enough to pass inspection, strong enough to survive. You had carried the pattern further, but tonight you would let it end with you. The rain eased into drizzle. Somewhere beyond the window, dawn began to pale the sky. You could feel its arrival before it came, the slow thinning of darkness, the quiet turning of the earth. You blew out the candle and listened to the faint crackle of the wick dying. The silence that followed was absolute, but not empty. It was the kind of silence that belongs to completion. You lay down upon the mat, facing the window. The world was a blur of gray and silver. You imagined the lilies bowing under the weight of the rain, resilient even in surrender. You had always envied their grace, how they bloomed for a moment and were gone, unashamed of impermanence. Perhaps it was all you had ever wanted, to live like a flower, briefly and honestly, without fear of how history would remember the garden. As your breathing slowed, you thought of the words they would write tomorrow, that you died of shame, of guilt, of grief. You smiled faintly into the darkness. Let them. They would never understand that you chose this ending not out of weakness, but peace. They said she died of shame, but perhaps she simply chose silence over noise. The morning after your death, the palace woke early. The rain had stopped, and the air was sharp with the scent of wet stone and smoke. A messenger arrived at the emperor's chamber carrying a single folded sheet, the final record of your life. It said little, no title, no mourning rites, just a phrase written in imperial hand. The Empress passed peacefully in seclusion. The court moved quickly, as it always does when trying to bury guilt. Within hours, ministers gathered to decide what would remain of you. The answer, of course, was nothing. Your portraits were taken down first. The artisans who had once praised your beauty were ordered to repaint the same canvases with new faces. Anonymous women draped in virtue. Your name was struck from the ancestral tablets. The tablets themselves were burned. The calligraphers worked through the night, replacing every mention of you in the official chronicles. The emperor did not attend. He issued no edict of grief, only silence, and silence, in the language of power, meant obedience to forgetting. The palace began its cleansing. The servants who had once brushed your hair were reassigned to distant provinces. The eunuchs who guarded your door were dismissed or vanished. Even the lilies in your garden were uprooted, replaced by peonies, the flower of loyalty, they said. But loyalty to whom? The wind still carried your scent when it blew through that courtyard. Some things, even imperial decrees, cannot erase. Outside the palace walls, the people heard a different story. The officials told them the Empress had fallen ill from remorse. The preachers declared your death divine justice. The poets were warned to avoid your name. Yet gossip, like water, finds every crack. In the markets, old women whispered that the Empress had died with a smile. Fishermen along the river said her spirit walked in the mist, searching for the garden where she once found peace. The palace guards, drunk and careless, told tales of how the emperor's face turned pale whenever he passed the western pavilion. And somewhere in a small tea house at the edge of the capital, a young musician played a tune that had been forbidden, a melody that carried the echo of rain on lilies. The dynasty pretended not to hear, but decay moves quietly at first. Within a season, the empire began to tremble. Crops failed in the southern plains. A governor rebelled in the west. The emperor grew ill, his sleep haunted by dreams he never confessed. Ministers fought in whispers, then in shouts. Taxes rose, loyalty waned. The same courtiers who condemned you now condemned each other. Power, once absolute, began to devour itself. Historians would later say the downfall began with drought or mismanagement or foreign invasion. But those who lived close to the palace knew better. They said it began the night the empire killed its own heart. When beauty and intellect became threats, when love was treated as sin, the heavens turned their gaze elsewhere. In the years that followed, the court commissioned new chronicles, clean, loyal, full of virtue. In those pages, you were no longer an empress. You became a warning, a nameless woman whose unruly passions endangered the realm. The scholar who once read poetry in your garden was forced to copy these lies by order of the state. He obeyed, but in one of the margins, he wrote a single line in faint ink. Her eyes held the truth they feared to speak. It was enough. Future readers would find it centuries later and wonder who she was. As for the emperor, he grew quieter with time. Some said he went gray overnight. He rarely appeared in public, preferring the solitude of his study. Once, on a spring evening, a servant found him in the garden, the new one, where your lilies no longer bloomed. He was standing barefoot in the mud, staring at the pond as if waiting for something to rise from it. When the servant approached, he whispered, "She was the only one who ever saw me." Then he turned away and ordered the pond drained the next morning. The empire survived him, but only for a while. After his death, the dynasty cracked like porcelain. Rebellions multiplied. The palaces emptied. The hidden garden, long neglected, fell into ruin. The plum trees died. The last eunuch who remembered you grew old and blind. Yet every morning he placed a cup of tea before the sealed pavilion. For her, he said, she liked it before the sun rose. And in the city below, the legend took root again. The storytellers revived your name, altering it slightly to avoid censors. Children heard tales of a sorrowful queen who had spoken with poets and died for truth. The common folk prayed to your spirit for courage when their own hearts felt caged. What the empire tried to bury, the people carried in whispers. Because gossip survives where monuments fail. Centuries passed. Empires fell and others rose. The palaces turned to ruins, the lilies wild. Travelers who stumbled upon the remnants of your pavilion swore that on moonlit nights, the sound of music drifted from the empty courtyard, soft, trembling, like the breath of something unfinished. Some said it was the ghost of a woman waiting to be remembered. Others said it was the echo of defiance that no fire could kill. And perhaps they were both right. Empires fall, but gossip survives. If this story touched you, whisper it forward. Remembrance is rebellion. I found her by accident, in a library older than most nations, where the air smelled of ink and dust. I unrolled a scroll whose edges had long since turned the color of tea. The handwriting was uneven, trembling, as though the writer's hand had fought the weight of her own world. Half the characters were missing. Some had been deliberately scratched out. But even through the damage, I could feel her. Not the Empress of the Chronicles, not the scandalous phantom described by courtiers, but the woman herself. I am a historian. My task, at least in theory, is to record without emotion, to trace lines, not lives. But that day, emotion arrived uninvited. I sat among shells of dead languages and felt something ancient stir behind my ribs. It wasn't pity. It was recognition. I had read the official histories many times. They spoke of an empress consumed by vanity, undone by passion, punished by heaven, a woman whose beauty had outshone her virtue, whose disobedience had brought ruin. It was a perfect story for an empire that feared women who spoke too clearly. But as I touched the scroll, I realized what the scribes had missed, or perhaps what they had erased on purpose. Her words were not wicked. They were weary. They spoke of isolation, of being watched, of loving what she was not permitted to touch. They spoke of a garden where laughter once lived and of the silence that followed. In one margin, faint as a sigh, she had written, "I am not cruel. I am lonely." I sat there for a long time, listening to the echo of her voice through centuries of dust. We live, now, in a world of glass instead of silk. We tell ourselves we are free, but I wonder how different we truly are. Every woman who has ever been told to smile through discomfort, every man who has been told not to feel too much, we are all living in palaces of our own making. Perhaps her story was not merely history. Perhaps it was prophecy. I traced the scroll's edge gently, as if touching her pulse. She had lived in an age when the female body was state property, when virtue was measured not by goodness but by silence. She learned early that obedience was the price of survival, and still she tried, quietly, desperately, to find meaning beyond obedience. Her rebellion was not loud. It was the act of being human in a place that demanded perfection. The ministers called it sin. The emperor called it betrayal. History called it shame. I call it courage. Because what is courage if not the decision to remain yourself when the world insists you disappear? I imagine her sitting there in her last hours, writing, unafraid, the candlelight trembling across her ink. She had no witness then. But perhaps she wrote for someone like me, someone who would one day read her words and see her not as a legend, but as a heartbeat. I wonder how many stories like hers lie buried under the weight of victory scrolls and court decrees. How many queens and concubines, mothers and daughters, were turned into lessons instead of people. History has a cruel habit. It mistakes obedience for virtue and silence for grace. When I teach my students, I tell them that archives lie, not maliciously, just conveniently. The keepers of records were human too, and humans are servants of power. The stories that survive are rarely those of the gentle or the defeated. They are the stories that kept empires intact. And yet, sometimes, a scrap of truth endures. A half-burned letter, a forgotten name in the corner of a census, a poem attributed to Anonymous. She survived in fragments. But fragments, if handled gently, can still illuminate a whole life. I closed my eyes and pictured her world. The stone corridors, the scent of lotus and ink, the sound of slippers brushing polished floors. I imagine her reflection in the bronze mirror, a face painted for worship, not for self. I imagine a hush when she walked past, the reverence that was really fear. And beneath all of that, the unspoken truth, that no amount of gold can quiet the human heart. When I finally spoke her name aloud in that silent library, it felt like breaking a spell. The word carried softly, echoing between the shelves, as though the air itself had been waiting to remember her. I thought of the ministers who had sworn to erase her, the flames that had devoured her letters, all their power, all their proclamations, and still, centuries later, she had found a way to speak. Sometimes history does not preserve us. We preserve history. In the weeks that followed, I read everything I could: court documents, surviving poems, rumors written in the margins of other people's manuscripts. The picture that emerged was not a monster, but of a woman who refused to die unfinished. She had been punished for seeking warmth. But her punishment revealed more about her jailers than about her. The dynasty that condemned her had collapsed soon after, as if the heavens had taken notice after all. Every empire imagines itself eternal. None are. The more I studied, the more I felt that her downfall was the empire's confession. When a society destroys its most honest voice, it signs its own death sentence. Sometimes, when the library was empty, I would speak to her in whispers. I know, I would say, they called you dangerous, but you were only alive. It comforted me in ways I could not explain. I am not a believer in ghosts. Not really. Yet there were moments late at night, when the lamps burned low and the wind shifted through the open window, that I could almost hear her, not words, just presence. A feeling, like standing near the sea at night, when the tide is invisible but you sense its power beneath the dark. Her echo has lingered longer than her dynasty. That is the quiet revenge of truth. When I walk home to the city now, I sometimes look at the women in the crowd, on trains and doorways behind glowing screens. Each carries a fragment of her. Each fights her own invisible trial. The difference is that today the palace has no walls. It lives inside expectations, algorithms, glass offices, dinner tables. The names change, but the story repeats. To be seen without being judged, to be loved without being owned, to exist without permission. Perhaps that is why her story still breathes. Because in her defiance, we recognize the unfinished work of our own time. I keep her letter, the copy I made, in my desk drawer. Sometimes I take it out and read the final line. It always stops my breath. Do not make me a warning. Let me be a question instead. A question, not a curse, not a lesson, but an invitation to think, to feel, to remember. And I do remember. I remember her laughter in the hidden garden, the music trembling through the rain, the lilies bowing under moonlight. I remember the silence of her trial, the calm on her face as men condemned what they could not understand. I remember her final night, how she wrote forgiveness into the air even as the empire turned its back. It's strange. When I read her story aloud to students, some of them cry without knowing why. Others sit in silence, as though something long buried inside them has been named for the first time. That is the power of her echo. It does not accuse, it awakens. We like to believe history is about kings and wars, but it is really about longing. The longing to be seen, to matter, to leave behind something more than a date of death. She understood that, and maybe that is why she endured, not as a warning, but as a mirror. Her dynasty is gone. The temples crumble, but her humanity remains.